We're back with our series of talks, chats with culture, policy and creative industries experts around Europe. I'm so delighted to go to UK once again, this time to talk with Tom Fleming. So Tom, nice to have you here with us. How is the crisis and the impact of the crisis to the culture creative sectors faring in the UK at the moment?
First of all, lovely to see you, Ragnar. Great to talk. The crisis, I think, like a lot across Europe, is hugely significant for the cultural and the creative industries sector in the UK, to the extent to which we don't really quite know yet the horror that is unfolding before us. Of course, it is disproportionately impacting on different parts of the cultural and creative industries, and there are certain parts of the sector that, where we even have to ask the question as to whether their doors will ever open again. And if they do, it won't be anytime soon. And there are other parts of the sector which potentially are actually lining up for some significant growth as a response to this crisis, because of course we know that it's impacting in terms of how we behave and how we consume. The challenge is, of course, how we also produce to meet future consumption. But I'd say overall there's a sense of real trauma. There initially was a sense of disbelief, and then there was and continues to be significant anger at the lack of coordinated strategic response from the UK government, less so from some of the key funders and investors like the Arts Council of England and Arts Council Wales, Arts Council Northern Ireland and Creative Scotland. So we have that arm's length model here. And of course, local authorities, which are the most significant arts and cultural funder in many ways across the UK. They are so hamstrung by the crisis, and obviously they have a duty of care to people who are so relatively disadvantaged and marginalised. But they also are hamstrung because we've had a decade of austerity in this country, which has made their ability to respond and act positively all the more difficult. I suppose it's worth just mentioning kind of almost two contrasting ends of the scale for the cultural and creative sector in the UK, and I'm sure that this is relevant in many other countries across Europe. If we look at the parts of the cultural system that are revenue dependent, that do not have a significant amount of ongoing public subsidy, such as nationally funded organisations or as grant funded organisations where they can rely on a proportion of their income through an outside funder, and those organisations that are dependent on selling tickets and on their cafes, on their retail, they are obviously in the deepest of deep crisis, and it's very difficult to think through how many smaller organisations, be they an independent cinema, a small local museum, and of course things like festival organisations and live music venues. It's very difficult to think about how many of them can survive this. And some of them will not survive this at all. And then we contrast right through to the other side of the cultural and creative system and think about high-end TV production. And of course, many people across the world now have become junkies focusing on Amazon, Netflix and other providers. Now, of course, the means for generating new content is currently very limited, but the likelihood is this will affect behavioural change and consumer behaviour. And the UK is a major centre for high-end television production, second only to the US. So you can see that there will be growth in certain parts of the creative industries with the right kind of investment and facilities and infrastructure. But the rug has been pulled, or is being pulled, from under the floor, under the shoes of many parts of the cultural sector. And just give one very real example. I'm the chair of a contemporary art gallery in Sheffield, in the north of England, and we're a national portfolio organisation for Arts Council England. So we have that anchor underneath us, but we're still losing significant revenue through our rents, because we have artist studios in our building, through hires, because we hire out spaces for corporate things, for charities, a whole range of different things. Our little shop, we've had to give a rent holiday to the cafe, and bar in the basement of our organisation, so that we're getting less income from them. And we can't envisage a situation where we can get up to our levels of revenue for many months after this. And that all depends on people coming back in numbers that they were coming in before this crisis. But we're relatively resilient. We will survive this. We will look different. We will feel different. We're very much becoming more digital. But we will survive this, whereas I think a lot of other organisations won't be in that position.
But is it the good thing about this the crisis that absolutely nobody talks about Brexit?
Well, we're still talking about Brexit because, of course, and it's interesting. We're doing a creative industry strategy at the moment for someone called the Great West Corridor, which is this strip of land in central to West London, which starts. It's got within it things like the Sky Campus. It's got something called Chiswick Park, which has got Disney HQ. It's got Pokemon. All these major corporates are there. Discovery Channel was there. A whole range of different things, and they are very much talking about Brexit because they see this as a double whammy. And a lot of firms are already looking to relocate their European HQs to other parts of mainland Europe because of Brexit, and that's all to come. Obviously, Brexit's happened, but it hasn't really happened yet. And there's a fear that the government is willfully ready to hide a no-deal Brexit amongst the debris of this COVID crisis. Because how can we point a finger at the negative economic impacts of Brexit because of the relative, the systemic destruction of the COVID virus on the economy of the UK and globally? So there is a sense that they might just use this as an opportunity just to, as they call it, get it done. They get it done in a extraordinarily destructive way. And there's also in the cultural system, many organisations that historically would have felt part of something bigger would have been able to access the comfort and the resource of European-funded programmes, whether it be Creative Europe or other types of things. They feel very much more isolated than they would have done. And we're only, we haven't really even had the Brexit yet. So we're in the beginning of that. And could there be a worse time to disassociate yourself from such a vital organ of solidarity? It makes even less sense than it did previously, and the cultural sector is really, really feeling that.
Tom, you, together with your associates at the Tom Fleming Creative Consultancy, you worked really across Europe, probably in most of the European countries, and across the globe. So you have much, broader view on the creative industry's policy strategies than just that of the UK. What do you think? How has the response of the global governance been in terms of the supporting culture creative industries in this crisis? Do you think it has been adequate?
No, I don't think it has. I think inevitably it's been inadequate because what this crisis has brought home is the growing fragmentation of strategic approaches to lots of things. So you can look at that country by country level, and you can see the way that this exposes inequality, health inequality, social inequality. It exposes the real fragility of work, in things like the gig economy, and the lack of artists' organisation, the lack of collective coordinated voice for culture. Exposes how, although governments have been very ready to celebrate the creative industries as a kind of vector for growth and as something that provides a lot of potential for GDP and GVA and obviously for soft power, in the good times, as soon as we've hit the crisis, we've recognised that it falls somehow between the cracks. It hasn't got the level of self-organisation and coordinated voice that other industries have, and therefore it hasn't got the power and the leverage. And at a global level, of course, the sector organises relatively informally. There are, of course, the international agencies like UNESCO, and the Resiliart programme is very welcome, but of course it's about sharing thinking and sharing the pain in many ways. It has a counselling function as much as it has a function towards reframing. So what I think we've seen is collective trauma, but without a collective voice. I think that there are lots of initiatives and processes underway where people are talking to each other more, which is great. There is a lot more sharing, which is good, but there isn't coordinated strategic responses yet through culture. And there need to be, and there's going to have to be if culture is going to retain levels of investment that it's been used to. And if we are going to reboot the creative economy in ways that are purpose-built for the post-COVID age, whatever that looks like. So I think that there's something fundamentally missing so far. What we've seen is a race towards rescue, which is fine and totally understandable, and that's what a lot of us spent the first few weeks of the lockdown process and linked to COVID doing. It's about rescue, it's about recovery. What we're not seeing is an argument around reframing or resettlement, and I think we need that. Because of the things I just mentioned. We can't go back to where we were because the systemic frailties are so apparent now in a crisis. So we need to, almost in a post-45 paradigm, look towards reframing the value proposition for culture at the heart of our societies, and in turn reframing the articulation of the economic value of culture beyond this more quick go for the race for the prize creative economy paradigm towards something that more effectively knits together the intrinsic value of culture towards things that build a balanced, fair, sustainable economy. And I think there are several things that flow from that. Fundamental things about rights. So the rights of the artist, the rights of the creative. There's something around sustainable business models or sustainable working practices for individual artists, creative practitioners, and differently sized, different types of cultural organisation in the cultural system. I don't think the irony has been lost on many people that the arts and cultural funding system across Europe and internationally in recent years is geared towards diversifying income streams, proportionately reducing reliance on public investment, and developing blended business models. And that's fine to a point, and to an extent there's been limited success in good times, but the businesses or the cultural organizations that are falling away now are those that were pioneering in developing blended business models because they don't work in this crisis, and those that have got the strong underpinning of public funding, whether they're national museums or national organizations or nationally funded organizations, they're the ones that will weather this storm somehow or another. So that suggests we need to reframe the strategic discussion around arts and cultural funding as one example. Another example is around how we do so in a way that those cultural organisations that are resilient can play a more proactive role in a new economy, a more social economy, a more inclusive economy, and one that recognises the health advantages, so the economic advantages of a healthy workforce, for example. So the role of cultural organisations today for mental health, for cohesion, for well-being is, I think, even more significant now, and in turn that enhances the economy overall.
Very good. This is really a big picture. Let's come back to the maybe to the individual cases. You mentioned the contemporary art gallery that you work with, and you work with many other smaller, mid-sized culture institutions, also creative companies, creative businesses. So what can they do? How can they survive? You mentioned digital transformation. We've seen this, especially in terms of the institutions, that probably the two last months during the lockdown have brought about more of a digital transformation than 2 or 5 or 10 previous years altogether. However, what we've seen is this huge amount, the waves of free online content, concerts, tours, visual tours, etc. But what's the business model behind it?
It requires a different type of analysis for different sectors and different places. I think obviously we've seen this radical and rapid digitalization response across the cultural sector. Some of this was already in play, but what they've done is accelerated their digital offer. partly because some of the, they're working from home if they haven't been put on government schemes that pay their wages but stop them working, as is often the case in the UK at least. So they've got to do something. And I think there are risks obviously associated with that. And some cultural organisations have looked a little bit lost in terms of how they've gone digital during this process. They're not sure around how to curate the content. They're not sure around how to articulate its role within this extraordinarily dizzying array of content that is available to us now, even before you think about cultural organisations. Others have been smarter and more strategic and have seen digital as a natural amplification of their physical offer, and also something that offers depth and a more immersive kind of complementarity to their physical. But absolutely enshrined in that is an assumption that people will still go back to the physical, and perhaps with a new hunger and a new alertness after the months of digital only cultural experiences. I feel that we're seeing where there are budgets, some quite interesting strategic approaches. So a lot of the national galleries and of national institutions have been really proactive in, for example, generating meaningful learning experiences for young people because they're stuck at home. But they've also looked at experiences and content curated towards other segments of the population, such as older people, who obviously are even more isolated because they're been told to be isolated in many countries. So that's become quite an interesting innovation. Of course, they're not digital natives, the older people. So how do you reach out to them in ways that are meaningful to them? And a lot of the large organisations have experts in place who have built those relationships and do understand that audience segment, whereas others haven't been able to. We're seeing more of a kind of gamification going on, which provides, I think, in the future, really interesting collaborative opportunities and business opportunities for the convergence of cultural institutions and digital games companies and design companies. And that's becoming more apparent now. But of course, budgets are slim to do that, and very few organisations have money to do those things now. So this is for me the main challenge now, is that we have at least a two-tier system. We always did have, but the capacity for innovation is going to be quite limited for a lot of cultural organisations because they haven't got the budgets to do that, or the range of skill sets under there and within their organisation. Whereas you look at the National Gallery here, or you look at some of the major museums across the world, and they've used this as a way of actually saying that we can broadcast, we can provide quality content that you'd expect to get from a high-end TV producer. Marvelous, fantastic, that's a game changer. But it's really hard for a small and medium-sized organisations to do that. And I guess that means we're going to get disruption in that there's going to be closures. We talked about this earlier on, and there's going to be incoming models. Will we see, as social distancing becomes more relaxed, will we see a renaissance of the kind of festival street producer kind of model, bringing things outside of institutions into the public spaces, into our parks, into our streets? Will they survive this? Those that are already out there. I know a lot of the large outdoor arts production companies are suffering enormously because this is their time of the year. But those that do survive, they might be in a brilliant position coming forward. So there are going to be collectively lots of losers, but there will be winners, and there will be radical change that will, over the medium term, bring really, really exciting and innovative solutions. But just in the foothills of that at the moment.
Naturally, this has been an unprecedented crisis, and you can rarely be ready for an unprecedented crisis. However, a question that I've been asking some other experts as well, has this crisis revealed something surprising, either positive or negative, about creative industries in your view? For example, have we seen that the creative industries were not as resilient as they were thought to be? Were they more conservative and less agile, flexible, innovative, as we have been preaching around for many, many years, or maybe there has been a skill gap that has been now brought forward, and it's clearly that in those times, these extraordinary times, we need people within culture creative sectors with the specific skills that they do not obtain. So what's your thinking?
I think your diagnostic there is spot on. All of those things I think are absolutely relevant to this, and I think in answer to your question, yes, it is unprecedented as a crisis, and I think it's revealed, in fact, widened the cracks that were already there. And those of us working in the sector and developing strategy and policy were have been very much aware of those cracks. But of course, we always assume that the crisis won't be as deep as this one, and I think that's caught us all off guard. Of course, it has. I think that the levels of resilience obviously also vary enormously, and the level of capacity to respond positively vary enormously. But one thing is clear, and I think I made this point a bit earlier on, is that it's just revealed to us how the cultural and the creative industries lacks the kind of strategic representation and the level of formalization that other sectors have. And that means making the case to government, whether it be for rescue packages or for new investment, is all the harder. Governments celebrate the creative industries in good times, less so in times like these, it seems, but there are of course exceptions. That's not to say the responses haven't been quite strong from organisations like arts councils, and we've been working with Arts Council Norway. They were straight on it, as you'd expect in a country like Norway. Took a little longer in other countries. Arts Council England, to be fair to them, have been pretty proactive and reflective and compassionate. The challenge for them is that they will run out of money, because they basically cancelled money that was committed for the future to spend on the present. So there are challenges there. So there's a funding system question at the heart of all of this, and our funding system isn't resilient enough to ensure that the cultural sector can be resilient. And the alternative business models that we've all been supporting around income diversification, they're not resilient when people can't go to somewhere to buy a ticket. If you're a cinema or a theatre, for example, you can't. Your business model depends on people going to the theatre. You can't replace that by going digital and becoming a service provider overnight. Nor do you ever anticipate that was what you'd have to do, because the crisis is unprecedented. But there are, I think, glimmers of hope. There are glimmers of hope in the way that the sector has responded. Sometimes it's been, as I said earlier, it's been fragmented, it's been a bit shrill, but I think that they did make inroads. Even in the UK, there were some inroads around, for example, the importance of providing some protection to freelancers. It's not going to be enough. A lot of freelancers are going to really struggle, but at least there has been some level of income protection for freelancers who earn under a certain amount of money. There's going to be lots of people who earn just above that, who won't get anything and things like that, so that's going to be an issue. But there has been at least some recognition and response. But that needs to, going forward, bring a consolidated strategic approach towards formalizing that part of the economy. And this is where there's a very crudely a kind of global north, global south disparity. There's the whole economies in parts of Africa and South Asia, etc., are informal. So there's virtually no protection there. And huge lumps of the supply chain are just going to disappear if the crisis hits big in certain contexts.
You have worked extensively with not only with institutions or neither governments or the European Union, but also you worked with local municipalities, with cities, with regions, with European Capital of Cultures. You've been doing a lot of work, even have part-time lived in Guimarães in Portugal. So knowing that the usual recipe for a strong ecosystem, the creative ecosystem in a place matches both the internal resources, meaning the residents, the well-being, the companies, but also the outside views, so the visitors from outside investment, etc. how do you what's your recommendation? What's your suggestions now to all these local municipalities and regions that you worked with when the tourism has dropped significantly and will not get back on track for a year or two or even longer to come? What can they do?
Wow. Well, there's a few things that they can do. I mean, the reality of the situation will vary, and I don't know how deep the pockets are going to be of some municipalities. Some municipalities will have reserves. Those that are lucky enough to be in the European Union will have rescue packages. Some of them will be sector focused, such as for tourism, hopefully also for culture, creative industries. And they will be able to hopefully imaginatively apply that investment towards reframing their approach to culture. I would suggest that the first things first, we need to look at culture sitting within a wider social paradigm. So this recovery phase is about how we live together as a society. It's about well-being. It's about cohesion. There's going to be a lot of fallout, obviously, from this economically, and obviously that also brings social unrest, mistrust, and all those things. And whilst we're all, feeling quite warm in some ways now about the way that we're all talking to each other more, we're on unlimited WhatsApp groups. Actually, there is going to be a social fragmentation inevitably as a consequence of this. So I think culture needs to go back to basics and focus on community engagement. It needs to focus on building partnerships with those in health and education and having a whole place approach to that. And I do think that some of the smaller cities are really well placed to be innovators here. Partly because they will have that intimacy, there'll be higher levels of trust. And I think also going forward, at least in the short to medium term, those will be the places that can bounce back quicker because they will be somewhere that maybe is more attractive to inward investment. They might benefit from exoduses from the cities. They might be more attractive to things like cultural tourism as seen as a relatively safe environment to go in. And people will even look at infection rates of COVID to inform where they might go for their for their next break, their next holiday. And there are smaller cities in relatively rural regions that are well placed to benefit from that. So I do feel it will be place specific in terms of what resources and what particular opportunities and challenges can be attended to. But I do not think that we can silo the creative industries as an economic sector by itself without also attending to culture as a social development tool for placemaking and for community development. So the civic needs to foreground the economic going forward. And I think that will actually be something that municipalities will be well placed to attend to. And it won't feel right in some places to develop creative industry strategies, let's say, yet, particularly those that haven't got very big creative industry sectors, because they'll be looking that's more of a longer term thing. It's more about getting back to basics. On things like European capitals of culture quickly and the festival economy generally, obviously this is hugely horrific for anything that involves large audiences and lots of travel. I really feel for Galway and Rijeka this year, and I don't know what this will mean for reframing European capital of culture as a model in the future. And I think there needs to be a close, hard look at this. And lots of cities that are working very hard as candidates now, developing their bid books, they will want to know really how the program is going to be affected by this kind of crisis in the future, what the risks associated are of another pandemic, for example, and you putting all of that investment and work into it. But I do feel that the European capital of culture can be a brilliant tool for collectivizing a strategic response to some of these big picture things that we've been touching on. I think they'll need to work much harder on the social contracts of arts and culture, much harder on environmental sustainability, and much harder on the connection between heritage as a historic resource and actually reanimating heritage as something that's relevant for today, and looking at local engagement and local audience development as much as looking nationally and internationally. So there's lots of interesting things that will come through this should that program continue, but we shall see.
The question that I've asked everyone is that when we would reconnect exactly in a year's time, in May 2021, what do you think the world would look like?
Ooh. What do I think and what do I hope? What I think it will look like is that we will be in the early stages of recovery still. And the economy, I mean, it all depends on what happens with the virus, doesn't it? And whether we're in this kind of constant backwards and forwards around lockdowns. If the virus is being managed and we've learned to live with that, then we will see a gradual economic bounce back, but nothing like to where we were. So there's going to be widespread global recession. And this is where the fear comes in, because global recession has social and health outcomes. And also we're in a very delicate stage with the growth of nationalism and things like that globally. So all these things keep me awake at night, and many, many millions of others, I'm sure. But I do feel that the positive response is that the European Union, alongside other international agencies, can use this as an opportunity to reframe the value proposition for culture. So I think over the next 6 months, that has to be a task force proposition. That has to be something that says, okay, we're not just looking at correcting and amending. We're going to actually root and branch review our commitments to arts and culture and the creative economy. And I think obviously UNESCO and UNCTAD need to come into this as well. We need to make this a big tent. And it has to be based on the assumption that there is a strategic uplift in the role and value and importance of culture, because we need it now more than ever. But it can't be going back to where we were. So I hope by May we're meeting and engaging in strategic conversations with large-scale structural change, the opportunity for us all to co-design. And we're also going to need, of course, to underpin that with evidence around what is happening to the cultural sector. There's been an absolute flurry of surveys, and we've all been involved in them and in different conversations, and people kind of essentially putting their finger in the air to some extent, trying to work out what's going on. We're going to need to, in the same way that you test and trace COVID as a virus, we need to test and trace the impacts of this on the cultural and creative industry sector, rigorously, vigorously, coherently, sharing knowledge over the next few months, so that when we come to this time next year, we have an evidence-based strategic approach to the future, because otherwise we'll be working in the dark.
Thank you, Tom, for your valuable insights, and I think your message for the need to reframe the value proposition for culture came out very clear in our talk. I hope to do this very soon again with you. And I hope you and your family stay safe and you all stay negative.
My pleasure, and same to you, Ragnar. Lovely to speak to you. Stay safe, stay well.